Great job as usual.
Our next presenter, Chris, is back to talk to us about lessons learned from UK research. Thanks, Chris.
All right, thank you. Thank you, and that was kind of a generic title, so I called Christine last week and asked her, about what she was thinking, and I had done a couple of presentations in Virginia the week before on hay, and so I thought I'd put those together and kind of give you an overview of hay as part of a cow-calf system. I thought that would dovetail in real nicely with John's presentation that he just gave us, and it's coming from a completely different angle, right? So he's producing really high-quality hay for the cash hay market. Most of us in here are producing hay, but probably not that high a quality in most cases. And that's kind of what I wanted to talk about, was a little bit about how hay can be a profitable part of cow-calf systems. So today I want to talk just give you a little bit of background material to kind of set the stage for the discussion of hay as part of profitable cow-calf systems. And then just talk a little bit about how we define and measure hay quality. And then tell you a little bit about a program that we have in Kentucky with regional hay contests that have been pretty neat to work with. And then talk about hay supplementation and feeding strategies, and just a little bit on my closing thoughts. Many of you have seen this graph before. This comes from a financial management part of Minnesota State University, University of Minnesota, a financial group there that actually doesn't just make budgets, but they actually get with farmers and go through their budgets. And this has 170 farms, cow-calf operations in it. And what I want you to look at is the biggest piece of that pie. When we look at cow-calf production costs, it's hay. Hay's going to make up 40 to 60% of the cow-calf budget, depending on your system. It's huge. Huge, huge, huge. And if we're going to remain profitable as we move forward, and we're in a cow-calf cycle, we're at a good point right now, and we want to ride that out as long as we can, but eventually calf price is going to come down. When it comes down, the person that wins in a commodity market like cow-calf market is going to be the low-cost producer. So we've got to remember that, and we've got to think about how do I reduce my costs? And when we do that, we've got to concentrate on the biggest piece of that pie. So that's scary, right? But what's really scary was the average production cost of a cow-calf unit in this survey of 170 farms. In 2023, it was $1,120. Just let that sink in for 1 minute. That's a pretty scary number to me. If you're going to be profitable, especially if calf prices creep down, you've got to be below this number. There's just no question about it. And that's really important to remember. I went back and looked. They have data on there for about 25 years, and I went back and graphed out the cow-calf production costs over the last 25 years. This is terrifying to me when I look at how steeply they have increased over the last 25 years. And remember, this is the average. So what's that mean? That means there's people above it and people below it. You guys know what an average is, right? It's like having 2 pails of water, one scalding hot, one ice cold. You put a foot in each pail. On average, you're comfortable, but it hurts like hell, right? So if we're going to remain profitable in the cow-calf business, we have got to be below this line. So just keep that in mind as we go on. This is another scary graph for me. Man, I'm full of scary graphs today. So Daryl Peel at Oklahoma State's an economist. He did an analysis and had a presentation on the amount of hay produced per cow-calf unit in Oklahoma. And what he found over the last 20 years was a steady decrease in the amount of hay produced per cow-calf unit. I went to our economist at the USDA NAS office in Kentucky, and I said, "Can you make me that same graph?" And he made me this graph. What I want you to look at is from about the mid-1970s till today, we've had a steady increase in the amount of hay produced per cow-calf unit in Kentucky. hay is negatively correlated in, I'm not saying always, but in most cases, hay is negatively correlated with profitability in cow-calf operations. So we really need to be thinking about how we minimize the amount of hay that we're making and feeding in cow-calf systems. And Daryl did a good job kind of parsing this data out, and this is not my thoughts, but Daryl's, about why we're seeing this increase in hay. And one was bigger cows. Cows are considerably bigger than they used to be. And I mentioned last week when I was in Virginia, somebody told me they were selling cull cows that were 1,800 pounds. I mean, that's massive. So we may have gone, as cattle breeders, we always go too far in one direction, then we go too far in the other direction, But I really do think we need to think about cow size as part of our system and think about how we moderate that. We don't have to have small cows, but man, we don't have to have a cow that's 1,700 or 1,800 pounds either. So that accounts for some of the extra hay. Storage and feeding losses, he said, accounts for some of the extra hay that we're producing per cow-calf unit. And then a longer feeding period, which is a little bit counterintuitive because we're tending, maybe not in Oklahoma, but here we're tending to get more frost-free days, so our grazing season's longer here, and we're tending to get, in general, more rainfall, so we should be able to grow more grass in this part of the country. All right, let's change gears a little bit and just talk a little bit about hay quality. And whenever we talk about hay quality, I always like to ask people what hay quality is, and we have lots of ways to define it. John mentioned relative feed value, relative forage quality, acid tertium fiber, neutral tertium fiber, in vitro true digestibility, crude protein, are all ways we try to get at hay quality. But really the essence of hay quality is the ability of that forage to produce the desired animal response. And that's kind of a moving target, right? So what's a good quality hay for a beef cow is not going to be a good quality forage for a dairy cow or for a horse. So we've got to kind of figure out what hay quality means to us and what level of hay quality we need for our operation. If we're a beef cow operation, we don't really need dairy quality feed in that operation, in most cases. Now, if you have growing animals or heifer development, maybe, yes, you need some higher quality feed. So this is just a table of nutritional requirements of different animal classes. And what I want you to look at, I'm not going to focus on it, but what I want you to look at is just the range in the requirements of different animal classes. So depending on what we're feeding, that's going to impact the quality of feed that we need. Even within an animal class, if we look at a dry cow versus a brood cow, dry beef cow needs 7 to 8% crude protein versus the lactating beef cow, which needs 10 to 12% crude protein. So a significant increase for a lactating animal. Energy is the same thing, 50 versus 60% for a dry versus a lactating beef cow. So we have to take that into consideration. So we need to define, as producers for our individual farms, what level of hay quality do we need, and then target that level of hay quality. I want to talk just a little bit about how we evaluate hay quality. And the first way is, it's a fancy word called organoleptic. That's just a fancy word for a sensory evaluation. Usually it has a card like this. Most of us probably learned how to judge hay in Forage or FFA. And what we're doing is we're looking at it. We're saying it looks good, it's nice and green, it smells good, there's lots of leaves in it, and then we assign a value to it and say this hay lot's better than the other hay lot. So we look at things like maturity and leafiness and color. Is it brown or is it green? Now in the cash hay market, color is very, very important, right? But in the cow hay market, I'm not so concerned about color as long as the quality's pretty decent on it. Does it smell like a nice clean hay smell, fresh and aromatic, or does it smell kind of moldy or musty? That tells you a little bit if it was put up a little bit too wet. Does it have foreign material in it? And in 2021, I got a crash course in foreign material at the research station. Our research station was hit by an EF4 tornado, and it destroyed 59 buildings on our research station. the entire research station essentially. And that whole winter I spent in the field picking up debris, pieces of shingle, pieces of roof with nails in it, all kinds of construction debris. We walked over 800 acres with 5-gallon buckets picking up things as small as the palm of our hand. Was not the high point of my career, to be honest with you, but it had to get done. So I've got a whole new appreciation for more foreign material in hay, and we certainly want hay to be free of foreign material. At the end of the day, this is a good tool for kind of assessing the quality of the hay, but it doesn't really give you any quantitative assessment, right? I can rank one hay lot maybe as being better than the other hay lot, and so on and so forth, but it doesn't really tell us the nutritional value of that hay. And that's kind of where laboratory analysis comes in. So laboratory analysis actually measures or quantifies different nutrients in the hay. And there's a whole list of them. The list gets longer every year. But essentially what it's doing is it's allowing us to compare the nutritional value of that hay to what the animal needs. And then make an assessment on whether we're going to need to supplement that hay or not in terms of the stage of production cycle of that animal. Most of the hay that's analyzed for forage quality in the United States, about 90% of it's done with a process called near-infrared spectroscopy. And what that process does is it takes the hay sample, we grind it up, we put it in a little cell like I'm holding there, and then we put it in that machine that's behind me, and it reflects light off of it, and it reflects light onto it and measures what gets reflected and absorbed in the sample. And then we can make calibration equations that give us all these numbers. It's very precise, very rapid, and non-destructive. So it's a great method of analysis, and most of the samples in the country get analyzed with near-infrared spectroscopy. So this is actually quantifying the nutritional value of the hay, and then it allows us to make an assessment of whether it's going to meet our animals' nutritional needs. I want to take just a couple minutes and tell you about a regional hay program, a hay contest that we have in Kentucky. We've got 3 of these. We've got one in the eastern part of the state, one in the central, and then one in the south central part of the state. And this is an extension agent driven program, so the extension agents go out and they get the samples, and they collect the samples, they bring them in, they dry them, and they grind them, and then they bring those ground samples to me, and I analyze them for forage quality in the lab, and then I do any other calculated values, and then rank them for the contest results. And then we have a presentation where people get ribbons at, right? So it's a contest, but really more what it is an educational program. We let people get some ribbons, and then we talk about what you can do to improve hay quality as you move into the next growing season. And I had one agent that called me up this winter and said, I want you to come to my county and talk about hay quality because I am tired of not winning this contest. So we're going to go and give her producer some tips on what they can do to improve forage quality in the samples they're submitting. Last year we analyzed 1,127 samples as part of this hay contest. I'm going to show you just two parameters today, crude protein and total digestible nutrients. Those are the 2 parameters that we balance rations off of, protein and energy. TDN is an estimation of energy in that hay. So crude proteins, and we call it crude protein because it's not a direct measure of protein, it's an indirect measure. We're measuring total nitrogen in that forage sample, multiplying by 6.25 to get crude protein. In this, let me take a minute and just show you how I set this graph up. We have the constituent here, this is crude protein, and then we have the range in the samples. And then on the bottom we have our different classes in the hay contest. We had grass hay, baleage, legume hay, mixed grass legume hay, and then an average over the whole trial. On each one of those bars there's a number. They're a little bit hard to see. I'll read them to you. That's the number of samples that was in each category. So in grass hay we had 528 samples. Baleage we had 95. Legume hay we had 55. Mixed hay we had 449. And then total we had 1,127 samples in the trial. And then on this we have 3 lines. The top line is the crude protein requirement of a growing animal. Second line, a lactating cow, and then the third line, or the lowest one, a dry gestating cow. So what we can see from this data on the crude protein is that all of our samples were in pretty good shape for crude protein in terms of a lactating cow. On average, remember what an average is, on average, those samples would meet the nutritional requirements for crude protein of a lactating cow. Some fell a little short for a growing steer. Everything met the requirements of a dry cow. So protein-wise, we're doing pretty good, and that's pretty standard. Usually, we talk a lot about protein, but usually in grassland ecosystems, protein's not the limiting nutrient. It's usually energy. So this was just, I went through the samples and I determined the percent of samples meeting the nutritional requirements of a lactating brood beef cow. So if I look at grass hay, about 75% of the samples met the protein requirement of a lactating brood cow. You know, close to 90 to 100 for the baleage and the mixed hay. The mixed hay was a little bit lower, probably around 90. In all the samples in general were about 85% of them would meet the needs of a lactating brood cow in terms of crude protein. Let's look at energy now. So we estimate in energy using total digestible nutrients. In total digestible nutrients is an estimation of energy value of a forage. We usually estimate that from something called acid detergent fiber in the sample. So we actually test for acid detergent fiber and then use an equation to come up with total digestible nutrients. And graph is set up in the same way, so I'll just skip that, except the total digestible nutrients on here. And then our three lines, growing animal, lactating animal, and dry cow. And what I want you to notice is that the grass hay on average, mixed hay on average, and averaged over all the hay categories would not meet the energy requirement of a lactating brood cow from this contest. Only the legume hay and the baleage would meet the energy requirements on average of a lactating brood cow in this contest. What's this tell us? This tells us that if we want to improve hay quality, one thing we can do is add some legumes to our hay fields. If we add clover or alfalfa to our hay fields, we're going to tend to push forage quality up. This was the percent of samples that would meet the energy need of a lactating brood cow. If we look at just grass hay, only about 14% of the samples met the energy requirements of a lactating brood cow. If we look at baleage, in baleage was up to 60, legume hay was closer to 90. Again, a good reason to put legume hay in your samples. Mixed hay was higher than grass hay, but still, you know, around 20 or 22% of the samples. What's this telling us? This is telling us that we're going to probably need to supplement most of our hay samples for energy this coming winter. So this is just the summary statistics for just grass hay. And what I want to point out is that on average, you know, we had 11%, almost 11.5% crude protein. Our TDN was 56.1, our estimation of energy for this grass hay sample. But we can't balance rations off of averages, right? Because we have a large range in samples. And what this is telling us is that we need not to do what our neighbor does or use the average of a hay contest. We need to actually analyze every hay lot that we're bringing into the farm, because there's a wide range in quality with different hay lots. So our crude protein ranged from 4.6 to 22% and 39% to 68% for TDN. So I just wanted to show you this tool. This is something that we have available online. It's called the UK Beef Cow Forage Supplement Tool. You can either scan that QR code or just Google UK Forage Supplement Tool and it'll bring it right up. What it does is it's not a ration balancer. It gives you an idea if you're going to need supplementation for a given hay lot. It's super easy to use, and it helps you from making a really big mistake in not supplementing animals that are on really low quality forage. So this is right here, this little piece. I'm going to blow that up so we can see it better. But this is that piece right there. So we're going to get a forage analysis back from the lab, and they'll look at different depending on which lab you send it to. If you send it to Dairyland or Dairy One or Waters or wherever you send it, it's going to look a little bit different, but it'll kind of be set up in this table format. We'll have a estimation of the percent dry matter and probably percent moisture in the sample. We'll have the constituents, and I just put the constituents we're going to use on this. There'll be more listed on your report. And then they're going to be expressed as fed basis or dry matter basis. For this, we always use the dry matter basis for this tool. And it says it right here, forage analysis, dry matter basis. So we take these numbers and we plug them into this tool. So 88% dry matter. This is for an average grass hay sample from our contest. 11.5% crude protein, 61% 0.6 TDN, 56.1%, not TDN, NDF, and then TDN was 56.1. Remember, the nutritional requirement of lactating brood cow would be 60% TDN. NDF, we use NDF to estimate dry matter intake. And the way we do that is we take 120, divide it by NDF, and that gives us an estimation of dry matter intake on the percent of body weight of that animal. The last thing we have to do is choose the stage of production. So for this beef cow forage supplement tool, we can either have lactation, mid-gestation, or late gestation, are our three choices. For this example, we'll just choose lactation. And then we page down the page and we have to select the supplements that we want to get recommendations for. I just usually hit select all, and that selects all those, and then hit calculate. And we're going to get a table that comes out like this. So for this particular hay sample, 11.5% crude protein, so we're in good shape there. Neutral detergent fiber, 61.5, and TDN, 56.1. We have an expected daily dry matter intake for a 1,250-pound cow of 1.95% of her body weight, or 24 pounds of dried forage on that cow. Okay, so it gives us that. It gives us our parameters we put in, and then it gives us how much supplementation we need for these different supplements. And as you can see, we need about 4 pounds of supplement per cow per day of these different supplements. And it varies a little bit depending on the supplement. On the bottom here, you'll notice it's hard to read from the back, but it says NA instead of giving you a recommendation. So NA means that it was more than the recommended maximum rate of 4 pounds. So it does not give you a recommendation. That helps you keeps you from causing a nutritional disorder in that animal by feeding too much of a given supplement. So we need about 4 pounds of supplement. I can get a commodity mix in Western Kentucky for $265 a ton. If I'm feeding 4 pounds a day per cow, supplementation cost per day per cow is going to be around 55 cents. Doesn't sound too bad, right? And if I supplement 50 cows for 60 days with this hay and this supplement, it's going to cost me around $1,600. If I'm not, and that's doing a pretty good job with grazing, right? If I'm only feeding hay 60 days. But if I have to feed hay 150 days and supplement with this supplement cost of 55 cents per cow per day, for 50 cows for 150 days, it's going to be over $4,000. Supplement can get in your pocketbook pretty quickly. If we produce a higher quality forage, then we can reduce this cost in our system. So there's a number of factors impacting forage quality, and I'm just going to mention them real quick. I'm not going to go through each one, but legumes tend to be higher in quality than grasses. Annuals tend to be higher in quality than perennials. Cool season grasses tend to be better in quality than warm season grasses. As temperature increases, we increase lignification in that plant, and that causes lower forage quality. Fertilization can impact crude protein, but generally not fiber as consistently. And crude protein, nitrogen fertilization also increases yield. Time of day, do we cut in the morning or the afternoon? You know, if I was in the western United States and I could cut in the afternoon when sugars and carbohydrates are at the highest from a full day of photosynthesis, I would do it if I knew it was going to rain tomorrow, but we're not in that part of the country. We're in a part of the country where we need to cut that hay to maximize our drying time, which means as soon as the dew gets off that hay in the morning. Stage of maturity at harvest. Vegetative is higher than reproductive. Harvesting conditions, rain and leaf loss. Rain at different times of the curing process has a different impact on the hay. So if we get rain right after we cut, it's not as detrimental as if we get it right before it's ready to bale. And then how we store it and handle that hay. If we store it outside uncovered, of course our storage losses and our quality is going to be lower. So the number one factor of all those things that impact forage quality is stage of maturity at harvest. Hands down, most important factor. So if you can do one thing to improve hay quality next year, cut your hay on time. If you're cutting it and reseeding your field at the same time, then you've probably waited a little bit too long to cut that hay. So single most important factor impacting forage quality, and this is why. As we go from vegetative to full bloom, our digestibility decreases, our intake decreases, and our yield increases. And where we want to be is where those lines cross at. So that's going to be late boot, early head for grass. For legumes, early head to mid bloom for our legumes. If we're over here and we're maximizing yield, which some of us do sometimes, and not willingly, sometimes we just get caught in a series of weather patterns that we just can't get it up. We're going to optimize yield, but forage quality is going to be really low. So if you think about one slide when you drive home today, think about this one. This was in our publication, Quality Hay Production, AGR 62, and this is the effective stage of maturity of tall fescue hay on forage quality and animal gain. So we had late boot, that's when we should cut it, early bloom, and then seed forming. And we looked at the impact it has on the different parameters. So if we look at properly cut tall fescue hay on time, 13.8% crude protein versus 7.6% crude protein when that seed is forming. If we look at digestibility, we go from 68 to 56%. If we look at dry matter intake, we go from 13 to 8.6 pounds per day. So this is important to remember. We're not only impacting forage quality when we delay harvest, but we're impacting dry matter intake. So I've got a crappy forage and they can eat less of it. That's not a good situation for the animal, right? So we've got to make sure that we cut it at the right time. And that translates into average daily gain. This was with stocker calves. Late boot hay, they gained 1.4 pounds a day. Seed forming, 0.42 pounds. A loss of a pound a day just by how we manage that hay. Cutting on time is important, and probably our single most important thing we can do to impact forage quality in our operation. Why don't we do a better job of cutting on time? I mean, there's lots of reasons. A lot of us work off the farm, so somebody else is writing our paycheck, we're going to show up, right? Cattle and forage are sometimes secondary enterprises on the farm. If we have row crops along or tobacco, tobacco gets set and taken and laid by before hay gets made, right? Older, poorly maintained equipment. I grew up on a farm in northeast Ohio. I never even knew they made new hay equipment. So, and that can be frustrating, right? But probably the biggest one is poor curing conditions. It's hard to get a baling day. A baling day is 3 days of drying followed by a 4th day to bale on, right? So poor curing conditions, then a heavy crop in that first cutting can make it really difficult to get that hay cured out. So generally speaking, in the eastern United States, we're tending towards more rainfall, not less rainfall. Unfortunately, in the west, they're tending towards less rainfall. So we can grow hay, but it makes it more difficult to get cured, right? This was an analysis that Matthew Dixon did, our ag meteorologist at UK, looking at baling days. This was the baling days from I'm going to choose Lexington since it's closest to here. This is 2000 to 2021, and we had on average in May, we had 5.5 baling days. In the same analysis, 2017 to 2021, we had 4 baling days. That's a loss of 1.5 baling days. So we're getting fewer baling days. That's 3 curing days followed by a 4th day to bale on. That's making getting dried hay cured harder and harder. And doing things like Mr. Russell talked about to try to shorten that period between when we cut it and when we bale it is really important. So what do? We've got to shorten that period between cutting and baling. So we either do that by speeding up curing or baling at a higher moisture. The best option for cow-calf producers, maybe not for cash hay producers, but cow-calf, may be using baleage, because we can cut hay one day, in some cases bale it the next day and wrap it for baleage. And that's a really powerful tool in terms of cutting at the correct stage of maturity. And that's the number one factor impacting forage quality. Some producers are using baleage as a rain management tool. And this was a little bit of a challenge to my paradigms when I thought about this. We've always said there's a kind of a moisture range between hay and silage, that 20 to 40% range, where neither one does a good job at preserving that forage. But producers are challenging that and it's becoming more and more common to use what we call sweet hay or almost dry hay, actually roll it up and wrap it as a rain management tool. So I'm trying to get dry hay, but it looks like rain's imminent, so I just roll it up, wrap it, and let it go through a partial fermentation. So it's not going through a full fermentation. I've got data to show that, but I don't have time to show that data today. We're getting less fermentation as the hay gets closer to dry. But when we exclude oxygen, the hay does not spoil, as long as we get enough plastic on that bale. So we did a study, I'm not going to show you the data, where we actually harvested and siled tall fescue all the way from the standing crop until it was dry enough for hay. And I had a student that would go out there every 2 to 3 hours and take a sample and then sile it all the way until standing crop till dry hay. And if you're interested in those results, I can show you those or send them to you later. All right, how am I doing on time? Anybody timing me? 10 minutes? Okay. I don't know. I'll do my best to work through this here. So I want to talk a little bit about hay feeding to grow grass. And this challenges people's paradigms too. And that's when we confine animals in late summer or put them in one paddock and then feed hay and allow the rest of the farm to accumulate growth or stockpile for winter grazing. This is a little bit different. We did a demo in western Kentucky where he took all the animals, and I'll tell you about it in a minute, but he took all the animals and penned them up. And anyways, a busload of producers came up to tour some farms from Tennessee, and they got out of that, and here's these cows penned up in one field, eating hay, and there's a sea of grass around them. And that old extension agent gets out of the bus, and he says, "What in the hell is going on here?" You know, but that challenged his paradigms to think about, you've got grass, but you're feeding hay. But in that situation, they were feeding hay so they could grow grass. So let me tell you a little bit about this strategic hay feeding demo that they did in 2006 and 2007. It was conducted in western Kentucky near Gracie, Kentucky by Kevin Laron, our extension animal scientist, and David Furquin. And that's far western Kentucky, just east of Land Between the Lakes. So what they did was they weaned calves in mid-September and then put those cows on corn stalks for a couple weeks until they had to come off to plant wheat. And then they put them in a dry lot and fed hay. And they didn't feed anything special. The hay was 10% crude protein, 51% TDN. So nothing off the charts in terms of forage qualities, kind of average to below average hay. And then they stockpiled pasture, and they started to graze that stockpiled pasture in mid-December, and then they went through March 31st grazing that stockpiled pasture. They monitored forage quality on the stockpiled pasture, 14% crude protein, 62% total digestible nutrients in December. By March, it was 12 and 61% TDN, so it really held quality quite well as they went through the winter months. and then they went back onto spring pasture beginning of April. So this was kind of the result. So the average cow weight at the beginning of this project on October 6th was 1,210 pounds. After the corn stalks and feeding hay in the dry lot, the cows weighed 1,345 pounds, so they gained 135 pounds during that dry lot period. And I know you're sitting there saying, well, that hay was kind of crappy they had, and it was. It was 10% crude protein, 51% TDN. But remember, these cows were dry gestating cows, so their nutritional requirements were quite low at that point in time. They actually were able to gain a little bit of weight in that dry lot. They scored the cows for body condition on December 15th when they started to graze the stockpile. They were 5.2. And by the time they came out of the stockpile on March 5th, they scored them again, and they were 5.5. So they fed them all winter, nursing a calf, and still gained 0.3 of a body condition score on that stockpile grass. That's pretty impressive going through the winter months. 97% of the cows calved by March 15th in 2007. In 2008, 92% of the cows calved by the beginning of March. The average hay cost, and I adjusted this for 2025 cost based on their prices, was $1.67 a day, so $1.67 a day. Grazing cost was 57 cents a day. So I'll just let you think about that for a second. I could feed hay for $1.67 a day, or I could graze for 57. Which one are you going to choose? We should be shooting for the grazing, right? So this price, because they weren't feeding supplement, if they were feeding this quality of hay to a lactating brood cow, there'd be another 50 to 60 cents in supplement per day to maintain body condition score. So that would have pushed it closer to $2, $2.25 a day. So just a side note David was able to feed less hay that year, and he saved a barn full of hay. If they had a moderate drought in 2007 when his neighbors were trying to scramble to buy hay, he actually didn't have to buy any because he had that hay that was saved that previous winter. Okay, real quick on, this is just the budget for tall fescue hay, and it's a budget from Virginia Tech. I just updated it for this year's numbers. $120 a ton for tall fescue hay. Yeah, I know some of you are sitting there saying, well, I can make it for $90 a ton or $80 a ton. And maybe you can if you don't pay yourself anything and you got all old equipment and you don't have any equipment costs. But anyways, I think it's reasonable to estimate 100 to 120 a ton for hay. That's a pretty reasonable estimate. So keep that in mind, that number in mind as we go forward here. So I want to just talk about approaches to hay feeding and then wrap this thing up. And there's two basic approaches that I want to touch on. And one is called stationary hay feeding. And that's, like the name implies, we feed the hay in one spot, right? So we don't move the hay feeding points around. We've got two people at the University of Kentucky. One's a stationary hay feeding guy, and the other one is a Bale grazing guy that's moving hay feeding points around. So I always joke that I like to get them in a cage match and see which one wins. I mean, they're both pretty buff. But they're at the end of either extreme. So when we talk about stationary hay feeding, it's in one location. It's easy for producers to feed with this system. It has ease of access. You don't have to trudge through the mud. Usually you put it beside a hard surface road. Localizes damage. Usually you have some type of a hardened surface to feed on, but you still have mud wherever those animals step off that pad at. No matter how big your pad is, wherever they step off, there's going to be mud. You got to scrape and haul manure, and I'm not 100% convinced that you capture all the nutrients when you do that. I think there's significant nutrient loss. And the nutrients concentrate around these stationary hay feeding systems. And then you have a significant investment in infrastructure. It's hard for a cow-calf to bear the cost of a lot of concrete. I mean, that's just a simple fact. And we've got to be very careful when we make investments that we ask ourselves, is that going to increase the profitability of my operation? Not all investments have to increase the profitability of your operation. Some are lifestyle investments, right? They make your life easier from day to day, and that's worth something too. So I don't want to take that away. But we do have to be very careful when we make big investments, because when I want to get out of the cow-calf business, I can sell the cows, but it's awful hard to sell a big chunk of concrete, right? Real quick, value of nutrients in the hay. I'm probably over time now. Are you somebody timing me? 2 minutes? I'm never going to make it. So we'll go on 2 minutes and then I'll take questions. But I do want to mention the value of the nutrients in the hay. And if we assume that we got 35 pounds of nitrogen, 12 pounds of P2O5, and 55 pounds of K2O, we do the math. This was the prices in mid-November at the co-op in Princeton. And we've got about $50 worth of nutrients per ton of hay. That doesn't include secondary nutrients and organic matter and so forth. And that's kind of where this mobile hay feeding comes in. And that's the second way that we can feed hay, and that's moving those feeding points around. And that minimizes damage in one area, still have mud around some of the feeding points if it rains, get a much better distribution of dung and urine, but you're doing a much better job at capturing the value of those nutrients in the hay, that $50 worth of nutrients, when you spread those feeding points around. You can use it in conjunction with higher quality forages like stockpile grass or winter annuals, and almost use that higher quality forage to supplement lower quality hay. And there's a lower total investment in infrastructure. You guys, I don't know how much hay is here, but in general around Princeton and Southside Virginia, it's somewhere around $100 to $125 a ton if I buy hay. Remember, we're getting a coupon when we buy hay, right? We're getting that it's nutrients that we're bringing into the system. It may not be $50, it may be $30 that we're capturing in the system, but we're still getting a significant coupon when we bring those nutrients into the grazing system. I'm going to go on. I want to show you one piece of data, and then I'll quit, okay? So for the last 3 years, we've been doing a study evaluating bale grazing as a tool for increasing soil fertility in pastures. And I just want to tell you a little bit about that. So we've got a 10-acre pasture at the research station that we focus on. This will be the third winter of bale grazing in that field. We soil sample along 2 transects. So you would never do this on your farm, but we put out permanently established lines through the pasture, 2 of those, and then we sampled every 20 feet along those lines to get a really intensive soil sample. And then we go back and we soil sample those exact same spots the following year. We put 40 hay bales out and uniformly distributed them in that 10 acres. And then we stocked them with 61 cow-calf pairs. And we used rings to minimize hay feeding losses. And we used temporary electric fencing to only allocate enough stockpile and hay for 1 to 2 days. This is just a photograph, and after about 1 or 2 moves, the cows kind of know what's going on, and they're waiting to move to the next set of bales. We had some areas that were denuded from tornado damage that we fed hay on to help regenerate those areas. This is an example of some of the damage that we see around those hay feeding areas. So sometimes we saw little or no damage, and sometimes we had damage like this when it rained when we were feeding hay, and that's just part of it. There were some days when we were doing this project, I'm like, man, we really made a bad mistake. But the pastures are pretty resilient if you have a decent sod in them. This was our first cycle of bale grazing. So this was different constituents, initial soil test, the soil test 1 year later. What I want you to notice is that everything increased except for soil pH. All of our nutrient levels and organic matter increased that first year. I did not expect that. I expected to be more of a gradual increase. If we look at potash, for example, our soil test value increased from 125 to 160 with just 1 cycle of bale grazing. This can be a pretty powerful tool for increasing fertility in low fertility pastures. Okay, this is just a fun one. We collected a ton of data on this project, but this was kind of a fun one. How many manure piles did we have per acre after we bale grazed one season? Any guesses? Give me a guess. Emma? How many manure piles per acre? 20,000? Oh, 12,000. That's not a bad guess. All right, we actually measured them. I say we, I use that term loosely. My students measured them. And they were pretty happy about it, I'd say. But when we looked at the average, we had about 1,500 manure piles per acre in one season of bale grazing. Pretty amazing nutrient distribution from just intensive management. All right, I'm going to stop there. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me up. Is there any questions? Gary? So we did some of that where it was still kind of wet, and it went through a partial fermentation. But you're asking about completely dry hay. I don't have any good data on that, but we talked about that a lot last week. And my thought is that it'd be ideal to let it go through a sweat, and then wrap it with 2 to 3 layers of plastic and just let it shed that water off. There is some data from Mike Collins at the University of Kentucky. Anybody ever see an M&W baler? So I got one nod there. There's not many people that have seen an M&W, but the M&Ws you could actually had an option to wrap with plastic film instead of net wrap or twine. And so Mike Collins did some storage work with that, and where they wrapped a barrel wrap, I call it, so it's open on the ends, but just around the barrel of the bale with plastic film, they reduced storage losses outside to 5%, which was similar to what they would have inside a barn. So that's a pretty big thing. If we could get a baling company to actually use a plastic film instead of a net wrap, we could really reduce hay storage losses. All right, I need to stop. Who's next? All right, one more. Yeah, so from a practical standpoint, what we did was start at the water, just like we're strip grazing, stockpile, tall fescue, and work our way around from that water. So when we sampled, you'll notice on that graph I've got zones. We sampled zones from the water. That's 0 to 250 feet from the water, 250 to 500, and so on. So, yeah. So the pastures were more disturbed as you got closer to the water, of course, because they're moving back and forth over that. All right.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Let's show our appreciation.